I want to start with, it's fascinating because this is such a family documentary. But let's dive back into the mid to late 60s when this project is first being thought up. Your dad, your uncle, when it started in 68, your uncle came and stayed with you guys and would bring home the talent after the shows. What was that like, living in a house with who knows coming over? I mean, it must have been just surreal.
It was surreal, and the thing is I was really young and didn't realize who these people were because the Soul show was happening at night and it was being taped live. So after the show, Ellis Haizlip would come back to our apartment, which was on West End Avenue and 80th Street in the Upper West Side of New York City, and he would bring the people that had just been on the show. So little did I know I'm bouncing on, James Earl Jones's knee, or it's Melba Moore and Clifton Davis. I had a crush on Clifton Davis, pinching my cheek. Or, Ellis Haizlip was close with Malcolm X's widow, Betty Shabazz. And so he would bring Malcolm X's children over to play with me, and we'd be running around under the table. But, I had no idea. It wasn't until I got older and started to realize the people in his orbit were special. But it was really because he was special and he had these relationships. It's hard to fathom that now when we're living in a land of celebrity and egos and everything. That wasn't what this show was about and the nexus of people. It was about uplifting the culture and giving opportunities for people who hadn't really had a voice yet. And what's so great about screening here at aGLIFF is that today, September the 8th,
It's the 50th.
is the 50th anniversary. So the first episode of Soul was taped on September the 8th, 1968.
That's crazy.
So here we are 50 years later, and it's just really exciting. It's so important to tell this story.
Do you mind if I ask, with your parents and their background, and especially your dad in education, as a whole, I think the family, you guys have strived for something greater and bigger. How has that made your impact in life so different than so many other folks? I think your family really made strives to do something important, and that it comes across.
That's such an interesting thing because, first of all, I think everybody is important. I tend to be an inclusionist, but there is a certain quality about that era, and particularly in my family and many African American families, post Depression era and post civil rights, the energy was about striving and about upliftment and about redefining not only culture, but what it meant to be black in America. And so much of our lives, even today, are associated with struggle, but there's so much more than just struggle in the culture, even today. And since Ellis Haizlip was also openly gay, and part of his identity was being gay and being, proud, so he was an activist for that, and he was an inclusionist as well. So many of the themes of the striving and the inclusion vibe and also being sort of leaders in black radical thought, that was part of my family and part of my upbringing. So translate that into 2018, and I feel like, gosh, it's a lot to live up to. But at the same time, I think we're all part of the struggle still, in terms of fairness and equality, gender parity. Like, these things are all really important to me.
Your film does a wonderful job. In the beginning, it touches upon live in color. And I think that's throughout the film we see that, but there was no color on TV in the beginning. And yet at the end, you do kind of bring it into the 21st century. Shots of just a group of talent that's there. Colin Kaepernick shows up. I love that idea. Was that always the idea of what you wanted to do with the documentary, open and end it that way?
It wasn't always the idea. The ending was always a challenge because innately the idea of a show that was really important to people and having it taken away, that created a real sense of sadness and failure. And even though it might have been what felt like a personal failure, it really wasn't. And so we were trying to figure out, how do we show the upliftment and the correlation between what the show was doing in terms of pushing, the ideas of independence and black power and all of these ideas of impact and how to impact the community. We wanted to make sure that that was relevant to a contemporary audience, because it's so easy to sit down and watch a documentary and say, you know, that happened 50 years ago, who cares? Or maybe shy away from it because it's too intellectual or something. But we thought there are real important themes that are the same sort of themes of struggle and independence and freedom of speech and freedom of character and freedom of life choices and life partners, that we wanted to show the parallels of what Ellis started and how far we've come, and yet how far we have left to go. So that ending montage is all about, well, look what happened since. Here we are, and there is Black excellence still, you know, and there still needs to be a place for Black excellence on television. I think it was there as a platform from Soul, but we still need that today. But I also wanted to show, look at all the people that have stood on the shoulders of someone like Ellis Haizlip, who was all about pushing for the culture and for art in the community, and for LGBT themes and the power of all of that.
I've got to ask, we get to see the origins of him becoming the host, and him not starting out that way.
Yeah.
How crazy is it to see that footage now compared to knowing that, you know, when you were a kid, it was a different, you know, I don't imagine you were watching the show when you were a kid. So when looking back at it, to see his evolution as an interviewer, I mean, I'm thinking of like those opening shows where he seems nervous, but then, I mean, the Farrakhan interview it's amazing. It's groundbreaking.
Yeah.
How much did you see him change just in those 5 years?
That's really interesting, Gadi, because we wanted to, it was really ambitious, but we wanted to show and draw a parallel between the biography of the man and the biography of the show. And so to show the evolution, if you will, of how the show started out, kind of humble beginnings, and then it was a local television show, and then with the Public Broadcasting Act, it changed and became a national public television broadcast. And then at the same time, you see the evolution, rather, of Ellis Haizlip, who was a reluctant host, and how his unique stamp as a person really affected the show. So as the show grew, and they had more vibrant colors and better directors and more production value, you can appreciate that, he grew into himself as a character. So we were trying to mirror those two things, because we didn't want to stop and say, this happened this year, this happened the second season, third season. We wanted it to be a little more artful. And so that evolution we were showing, at the same time drawing in the evolution of what was happening in America, in our culture. So we actually started, if you can imagine, by filming 3 separate storylines. So the storyline A, which was the Ellis Haizlip story. So that's who Ellis was during those 5 years of Soul, before and a little bit after, so we know where he went. Then we had storyline B, which was the story of Soul. So we knew those 5 years from 68 to 73. Then we had storyline C, which was actually the zeitgeist, what was happening in America, and how to contextualize that historically, the story of our people, of Black people, and the evolution from, you know, post-civil rights to the present. So that was a lot. But we had to prove that those 3 storylines could coexist, and we collapsed them on each other. But we literally had 3 different string outs, if you will. That's what we call it in filmmaking. You know, so we had the Soul storyline, the Ellis Haizlip storyline, the Soul storyline, and the Zeitgeist storyline. And so you could watch them as separate films all together. And then we collapsed them and found the most salient points to match up.
Wow.
And that was really hard, because we had to be economic with the storytelling, of course. This is a lot of content and a lot of history, and we had to be really accurate. But everything had to prove its way into the story. So even though we had like this amazing archival footage, we couldn't put all of it in there. So it had to match up and earn its way in.
As far as breaking down, I think maybe in the third string, the music to dance, the evolution of the show, and then to the poetry. Obviously, Baldwin was very early on as well. And I know your uncle had a long history with James.
Yeah.
What was it like diving back into his world before that? I think that was one of the special things of his work in the theatrical side of things in Europe, and him being over there. especially with James. I think that's kind of a real strong point.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about just before the show, the impact of your uncle on the scene as it was, mid-'60s?
Sure. He was really involved in the theater, and it was really hard as a black man to get a job in the theater, to be a stage manager or producer or any kind of impactful position. If you weren't in the union and you weren't white, you probably weren't going to work on Broadway. But he still had his finger on the pulse of everything that was happening in the arts. He knew all the dancers, he knew the important people who were making important strides. And so he was working in theater, he was producing, and he was working at a theater up in Harlem. And little by little, because he was so connected to all these artists, he realized that if he could take that idea of theater and bring it to the television stage, that he might have the same type of impact. But before he did that, he had to go to Europe, and he was traveling with Marlene Dietrich. He met up with Jimi Hendrix. He basically just knew everybody. He was touring with Alvin Ailey and touring with several different theater shows. So all of that really sort of laid the groundwork for having his finger on the pulse for what he could bring to television, a certain theatricality to it. But because there were no blacks on television, there was no precedent for that. So that's what made Soul so unique.
Alvin Ailey is an important part of not only that movement, but the show itself. When the dancers were brought on, and also in your background, I know dance is very important to
Yes.
you. That, as far as the dance element, how much, because we don't get to see too much of, like Gregory Hines. I mean, I know you have a long history with him, but how important was it to showcase the importance of dance and how it changed the way television showcases dance today? I think what Ellis was doing, no one had ever thought about doing. He was bringing elements like the dance elements that was with Stevie Wonder. No one had ever thought to do that.
Exactly.
That's groundbreaking material.
Yeah, so that scene is really key because Stan Lathan was an important director, one of the first directors on Soul, and he had a love of the dance. And so the idea of bringing together the dance world and pop culture was really unique. To have Stevie Wonder singing this amazing song, and then to have the dancers who were brought from the Alvin Ailey Company and also from George Faison's Universal Dance Experience, and then combine that with George Faison, the choreographer. It was just really groundbreaking because dance was so much a part of the cultural expression of black people, but had never been given that type of platform or validation in a way. We think of Alvin Ailey and the company as being sort of a flagship African-American and all-around American universal dance type of experience, but in the beginning it wasn't that way. There was so little funding for the arts, and there was little funding for dance in particular in the black arts culture. But the black arts culture was all about bringing that forward. Black poetry, black radical thought, dance, art, movement, and music. And so that was a natural thrust for him. I think what was unique for Ellis was that he was saying this is just as legitimate as anything else, just as important as the expression of poetry or critical thinking. So to have the Alvin Ailey dancers and Stevie Wonder was just like a dream come true. It's amazing.
Being radical, I think Ellis's idea to bring women on the screen, and not only that, but to do an entire end season where it was showcased all the women. Yeah. That's got to be something that stands alone in TV history. Absolutely.
I think he was somewhat of a feminist,
Yeah.
And that was unheard of at the time. With the women's movement really just popping off at that time in the 70s, the subdivision of that, of being a black women's movement, was really not put in the forefront. I think there's still some elements of that today. There seems to be a division in feminist thought, but that's another conversation, of black feminists within sort of the larger culture of feminism, but I'm hoping that will change. But so Ellis really always knew that black women were doing something very important and was trying to promote that and to give them opportunities to be hosts on television, for example. So he put forward Nikki Giovanni to host an amazing two-part special that they shot in London, of all places. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been logistically. Just go take a remote, crew and go to London. The thing is that James Baldwin was living outside of the country. He was living in France in St. Paul de Vence, and he didn't want to come back to America to be on the show. So Ellis said, well, we'll meet you halfway, and they chose London. So they did this amazing conversation with Nikki Giovanni interviewing James Baldwin, and that's a real sort of set piece from the film. I could watch the whole thing, really. But the idea of putting women out front and showcasing women as being the architects of this movement, but not necessarily having that acknowledgement. He always knew that that was important, and just as important as the black women in the civil rights movement. You know, they're always out there. It's just a question of, are they being acknowledged?
It's fascinating to see the amount of talent that he kind of found.
Oh, yeah.
He's the first to put a lot of talent on the screen for the first time.
Absolutely. When you think about it, it's mind-blowing. So you have Earth, Wind, and Fire for the first time. You have Al Green for the first time. Because you have to remember, this was before Soul Train.
Yeah.
And, our sort of collective knowledge of black television, the first thing we think of is Soul Train. But he also had people like, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells for the first time.
The first show was her singing
Over the Rainbow.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. And Arsenio Hall for the first time. He was 16 years old doing magic tricks. So there's definitely a through line there, because we all know what happened to him. But also Roberta Flack and different artists that you wouldn't expect, and some elusive artists too, like T.S. Monk Jr. and Thelonious Monk played together, father and son. And that's not something you see every day.
I don't think anyone else has ever seen that.
Oh, no. And to have jazz artists at a time when jazz, again, hadn't been validated. What Ellis was saying is there's a renaissance here. And there's a richness and a layered and a complex layering or complexity of black culture that you're not seeing. Because remember, you have to think about what had just happened. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated in April of '68. And with all the riots and people pushing back against the dominant culture, the perception of African American culture was not favorable. It was all about looting and struggle, and Ellis Haizlip said, but there's so much more. There's a richness, and I want to show it to you. And so that was that kind of love and honesty and the layered complexity and the duality of all of that was what the show was about. So I think it's like a rich tapestry that you really don't see today.
Yeah.
That kind of honesty.
Yeah.
And that was our modus operandi, was how can we be really, really honest with this film and not make it just a set piece for celebrities, because everyone's famous now, but that's not what it was about. It was the journey of a people, and I hope that comes across, that sincerity.
Well, talking about the sincerity and the honesty, going into your own family, I think the most powerful moments are when Harold's talking about your grandfather and specifically what he would say to Ellis. I think, I kind of broke down in that moment. Can you talk a bit about that and the moment when Harold takes us back to the house? I think it's one of the most beautiful moments of the movie, and to see this tiny little home and to know so much of important change happened just right there.
Yeah. That was really hard to do. There's a thing about, especially that certain era of folks from the family, and in many black families, and many families in general, especially families in which, people, same gender loving folks have emerged. It was difficult. Things were held very close to the vest. And so to get Harold to open up, it took about 3 or 4 interviews, maybe 5 interviews with him and we had to pull him aside and say, I really need you to anchor us in this moment. And I know you're protective of Ellis Haizlip, but what I need you to do is open up and share with us. Because the challenge is having a story about someone who's deceased, right? So Ellis Haizlip died in '91 of cancer. And so you don't have him speaking. You see him as a host all the time. So the challenge with us was, how can we make him have agency? Who can tell the best stories about him? But also, how can we feel like he's living and breathing in this film? And so for me, Harold really embodied that personal connection. They had grown up together and loved each other. And you really feel from someone whom Ellis trusted, that his personality comes through. And so I had Harold drive us through the old neighborhood, and I was able to direct him, was hunched down in the car in the back seat. But it just came very naturally to him because they were stories that he'd safeguarded for so long. And I think that sort of genuine quality was so rich. I still choke up every time I see that part.
How's it important to also touch upon the impact gospel had on the family? Harold's a part of that as well, going to the church. Mm-hmm. And that became a part of the show. Absolutely.
And what I'd love to say about that, Gadi, is that the African American church and gospel and Baptist, we have to remember that community was such a staple in the family at a time when so much segregation was keeping black people apart from regular places where people would convene or just have a natural kind of entertainment or a nightlife. So if you don't have that and you're segregated because of Jim Crow, not because of anything else but just what our country was going through, you turn insular and the church becomes everything for you. The church is not only your sustenance, but it's also your community. It's where your theatricality comes from. So Ellis Haizlip and James Baldwin shared that kind of upbringing, sort of strict, a little bit conservative Baptist Christian upbringing, but it also informed him in terms of the beauty and the uniqueness of soul rooted in that culture. And so we wanted to show the church that he came from. And then he took that, what his idea of the gospel sort of, according to Ellis, was the gospel, I think he says the gospel according to soul or to R&B. And that was really key to sort of draw that element because he took the church and he combined the gospel music with Nikki Giovanni's poetry. And that was his idea. Then that became a live performance on the show, and then that became the Truth Is On Its Way album, which was her amazing sort of incredible performance that she did. And he produced that and produced the album for her.
And I agree with her. They should give her a Grammy anyway.
Yeah, they should. She's still mad about that. Well, because it was, nobody had done that yet. Yeah. And there wasn't that spoken word was not a category, really. So if you look back and see how gospel music and early rap, like the Last Poets, like that became sort of the footprint for gospel music and also for spoken word and performing.
How does he get away with putting the Last Poets in that first season? It's amazing to see it now.
Yeah.
And yet to imagine it in '68 must have been insanity.
Oh, it was radical. Because you have to remember, so that particular episode was the 5th episode of the show. So it was October 24th, 1968. So imagine 5 shows in, and you're going to put the Last Poets on there, who are tearing it up and using the N-word, prolifically. But it's, with the context, is really, really important. And so Ellis saw that, and, later on in the film, I think it's Sonia Sanchez who says, Ellis Haizlip was seditious, So on the outside, he appears like this classic sort of middle-class black man, but really he's seditious, and he's trying to change the needle, move the needle on culture. So to put the Last Poets on there, the lights lit up at Channel 13. They all thought they were going to lose their jobs because it was pre-FCC and it was non-commercial. So you didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah,
so
no delay, no nothing.
No delay, no nothing, no 7-second delay. So nobody could really stop you. So he used that, secretly as a platform to push forth these sort of radical ideas. That was good and it was bad, Mm-hmm. I think that was what does Harold say in the film? That was its something, and also its undoing. I forget his exact quote, but basically saying that was the most incredible thing about it, but that was also what took it down in the end, because he wasn't willing to compromise that kind of edgy, progressive, revolutionary stance on television, and they probably weren't ready for it.
It begs the question, we only have 5 years of it. Imagine if we'd gotten at least a decade,
right?
How things would have been different.
And that's why I put that last piece with Questlove at the end.
Yeah.
Questlove incidentally, has seen every show. He has this like encyclopedic memory of music and culture, and he travels all around the world collecting stuff. So somehow he has managed to see every show. And actually, we did this interview with him at the Tonight Show right after he came off stage, and you can still hear the Tonight Show being taped in the background. And he comes into this little room, and we set him up for the interview, and he begins to tell me everything about soul. And I'm like, what? Like, how do you even have the bandwidth for something like that? And he said that soul, he was raised like that, and that his parents were sort of real progressive, Black Power, not militant, but really woke, as we would say now. And that influenced him and the way he did his sets for the Roots, that they patterned some of their things that they did after what he saw on Soul. And so being able to speak with him, Questlove is just amazing. He's really out there. He's a writer. He's a prolific band leader and musician and statesman on the culture. So to be able to have him say at the end, can you imagine where we'd be now if Soul had been on for more than a decade? Or I think it would be different. I think we need it. I think we need it again, and I'd love to see it re-air, or maybe even create a new version. Something I'm hoping to pitch pretty soon.
That'd be amazing, yeah. The importance of showcasing Nixons Rise, the way that changed the landscape of America, obviously reflects very similar to what's going on right now. How important is it that this film is coming out right now?
I think it's hugely important. I think that our administration, there's so many obvious links, and I wanted the audience to come away with their own feelings and their own, revelations. So we didn't push that too hard. But the obvious parallels between the Nixon administration coming down hard on the Black community and the whole idea of the war on drugs really being a war against the people of color. There's so many themes that marry that administration with our current administration. We had a nemesis automatically built in with Nixon, but we chose not to include the current administration in the film because we thought, let everyone come to that realization themselves, because we wanted it to be not so on the nose. But I think that this film is really important right now in a climate where there's just so much hate and misunderstanding and misrepresentation and oppression and division. I think it's important to look at a show and a climate and a movement that really parallels the movements that are happening right now. Really, really very important. And let people come to their own conclusions about that and be inspired by it.
I've got to ask, it's the 50th anniversary, but this year in particular is very important because we lost Harold just this year. How cathartic is getting this story out for you personally?
Well, I wish Harold could have seen the show and seen the film, but I knew that it took 10 years to make the film. And so everyone has been with us along this journey, and I think that the gift that we have now is being able to share it with the people, to be here at this film festival, and our film festival is coming up. We are looking for a distributor to reach a wider audience. But this year is really, really key because you can feel a shift happening, and especially how we're going to vote in the upcoming elections. And people are waking up to realizing that they have their own agency. I think we've always known that, but the resistance that this administration has created has actually been fruitful in creating a movement. In the last couple of years, as we were making the film, I would come across a lot of young people, and they would watch the film and they would just say, wow, the difference is they were responding to something. They're fighting back against oppression and what was happening during civil rights. And I would say, well, we are doing that now too. It just might not be as visible. But now it's visible, with Time's Up and with Me Too and gender parity and equality. People are really, really fighting back now. And I think that this film, it's not only a celebration, but it's a wake-up call. That if we can do it and galvanize as they did then, we can definitely do that again now. So it's a little bit of a rally cry, as well as being entertaining, but this year is pivotal for that.
To go from aGLIFF to where?
After this, we're going to be at the Urban World Film Festival in New York City, which is exciting because we'll be screening on the day that's Ellis Haizlip's birthday. So between today, which is the anniversary of the show, and Ellis Haizlip's birthday, we're hitting all the marks there. Then after that, we'll be at the LA Film Festival, which will be very exciting. And we're continuing to take the film around the world, and we're taking it to BFI, the British Film Institute.
Oh, wow.
So that'll be our first time, and I'm going to try to hunt down that studio where James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni, and the film never stops, you know, I'm always documenting. So we'll be at BFI in London and a couple others. So it's really exciting to be able to share the film and take it everywhere.
Can we follow you on, is there social media for and websites?
We're on IG, Instagram at Mr. Soul the Movie. Same with Twitter, Mr. Soul the Movie, and we're on Facebook, Mr. Soul the Movie. Yeah, so jump on. We try, if I'm not working, I'm, you know.
I saw you filming at the party, so I know it's real.
The problem with being a documentarian is you want to document everything, because every step of the way, we don't take that for granted. And I learned that also from Ellis, because he was a curator, not just of culture, but of, you know, intimate moments. And for me, it's the intimate moments that count the most. And meeting people like you and being here at this festival, it's all really significant. It's not lost on me, so thank you.
Well, thank you for telling the story and telling it the way you did, to take the time to have different strings and different layers to this film, because I don't think it's a typical documentary.
It's not, and I'm really grateful that you've embraced it and that others are feeling that way, because it was a real leap, you know, because we didn't want it just to be clips and heads, clips and heads, clips and heads, because that is standard, and you see that a lot. But we knew that this story was complex. And then when you add the element that, you know, Ellis Haizlip was gay, and, you know, all of these things had to be handled really compassionately, and we didn't want to exploit anything at the same time. So that was the challenge.
Well, Melissa, thank you for the
thank
time,
you.
and I can't wait for people to see this.
Thank you so much.